Good morning. I want to welcome you all. We're so pleased to have so many distinguished guests for this very important event. My name is Robert Shapiro, and I have the privilege of serving as the Symposium editor of the Pepperdine Law Review. And on behalf of the Law Review and the Pepperdine School of Law, we want to welcome both our guests here in Malibu and those that are live streaming this event to our Symposium on the United States Vice Presidency in History and in the Future. At a time when politics dominates our national discourse, we're here today to discuss one of the most important roles in our system of government. The Vice Presidency is unique, not only in its constitutional placement, but also in the many important questions that continue to surround its function. It was caustically described by the very first Vice President as the most insignificant office. And yet now we see that so many Vice Presidents have had a profound impact not only on the administration in which they served, but also on our national history as a whole. And yet, despite its prominence, the office of the Vice Presidency remains widely misunderstood. And again, so many important questions continue to surround its function. It's those questions that we seek to answer here today, and we are very, very honored to have with us a distinguished panel of guests. The speakers you'll hear this morning are some of the foremost experts in the areas of American history, constitutional law in practice, and American politics. We are especially honored to have with us two very special persons, our keynote speakers, former U.S. Attorney General Mr. Edwin Meese and the 46th President of the United States, the Honorable Dick Cheney. Please join me in welcoming them. In a few moments, I'm going to ask our first speaker, Ambassador Douglas Kmiec, to come up and speak more in depth on the questions we'll be covering today and the importance on this topic. But first, I want to give just a few reminders to our guests. As you saw on the way in, video recording of any kind is prohibited during the time the speakers are giving their presentations. If you would like to rewatch any of the presentations, we will have a video archived on the Pepperdine Law Review website. Also, if you'll look inside the welcome packets that you received as you registered this morning, you'll notice that there are two index cards in each packet. Before our moderated time with Mr. Meese and Vice President Cheney, we will send around Law Review staffers to collect written questions to present towards the end of their discussion. If you will begin to think of any questions that you might like to ask and have those written down, we will collect them at the appropriate time. And finally, if you are a Pepperdine Law student, you'll be pleased to know that your professors have asked that if you have a class, that you please not leave until our break at 11:15, so as not to disturb the speakers. And finally, let me introduce our first speaker, the man who really had the vision for this event, an American legal scholar, diplomat, and author. Former Ambassador Douglas W. Kmiec holds the Caruso Family Chair in Constitutional Law here at Pepperdine. Douglas Kmiec served Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Bush as constitutional legal counsel, and also has served in the Office of the Attorney General, the Office of Legal Counsel, and the U.S. Department of Justice. Nominated for Foreign Service in 2009 by President Barack Obama and unanimously approved by the Senate, Ambassador Kmiec served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Malta. He is an acclaimed writer and speaker and the architect of this event. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Doug Kmiec.
Good morning, and thank you, Rob. I just received something that I want to share with you. This is a New York Times story from Michael Barbaro. It's a story that begins that says, after huddling with its foreign policy experts yesterday, GOP frontrunner today announces his running mate, Colin Luther Powell, 78. The first African-American to chair, and only African-American to chair the Joint Chiefs. Powell, a retired four-star general, was Secretary of State from 2000 to 2005. The highly decorated Mr. Powell is widely respected and thought to add credibility and weight to the Trump campaign. It was apparently an announcement that was widely received with applause. Currently, Mr. Powell is the co-chairman with his wife Alma of American Promise, an organization that is aimed at fostering character and competence among young people. Apparently, when Mr. Powell accepted, he said, "I see working with Donald J. Trump as an extension of my work with troubled youth." The announcement seemed to take everyone by surprise, including the attendees at the Symposium of the Vice Presidency at Pepperdine University, who at this moment had forgotten that this is the 1st of April. So I have totally exhausted my credibility at this point. Well, let me begin. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Attorney General, distinguished scholars of law and public policy and political science and history, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this conference on the Vice Presidency. Will Rogers said that the Vice Presidency was really the best job in the world. He said, all you have to do is get up in the morning and ask, how's the President doing? Indeed, one can, in fact, find lots of quips about the Vice President. Even the U.S. Senate website reports that it's the least understood, most ridiculed, and often ignored position in the government. Other people, like Woodrow Wilson, remarked that the chief embarrassment about the office is that when you say that there's little to be said about it, you've pretty much exhausted what there is to say about it. Of course, there's the famous John Nance Garner, who likened the position to a warm bucket of spit. And Harry Truman, even more colorfully, said it's like the 5th tit on a cow. I don't know what that means, but those of you from an agricultural background can help me with it. So, those are interesting comments about the second highest office in the land. They are humorous. And it's good that we've got a country that can laugh at itself. But it is a difficult time, isn't it? It's a time when there's a crisis of dysfunction in the government of the United States. It's almost a crisis akin to the time of the founding that gave encouragement to a constitutional convention to move past the Articles of Confederation. You remember the Articles of Confederation? Every school child remembers it didn't work. That unanimity was required for far too many things, for raising an army, for raising funds, for making any kind of commercial regulation, and it didn't work. It was, sometimes reminds me of what maybe our friends in Europe are going through, trying to stitch together the European Union and to work past their difficulties. And it's not just a crisis about disagreement over one issue or another. It's a crisis where there is so much stalemate and so much gridlock that nothing gets decided. And that, ladies and gentlemen, if you share that concern, brings me to the Vice Presidency. Now you're saying to yourself, well, how can this much mocked, much ridiculed office have any hope of helping on this profound problem? Well, the origin of this symposium started in my mind when I was had the privilege of being my country in a foreign country. There's no greater opportunity than that, as far as I was concerned. But one of the things I started to notice, I had been taught by my school teachers that America was the greatest democracy on earth, and that it was really a democracy of great achievement. It could always be counted on. And I noticed among my European counterparts that they were having an easier time of it. That they were having an easier time of getting executive and legislative agreement. And of course, one of the reasons that is because they were parliamentary in their focus. And we had chosen a presidential system. And we chose a presidential system for a good reason. It was a reason given to us by Montesquieu. Montesquieu reminded us that if you concentrate power in a single hand, It's the very definition of tyranny. So if you put those three branches in one hand, judicial, executive, legislative, you've got a problem. And the way in which the founders addressed that problem was by separating powers. But separated powers also, Robert Jackson reminded us, have to be brought together, have to be integrated into a workable and effective government. And that's the two sides of the separation of powers. And it's that second side, that side of forming a government that works, that brings us to the vice presidency. Because he stands out as this person who doesn't have a job function. He stands out as this person who has only one explicit textual role in the Constitution, and that is to be president of the Senate, a distinctive legislative role. Of course, he is the president in waiting in the event of death or disability or inability or resignation or removal. But other than that, this seems to be a greatly underdefined position. How could these framers who we revere, and revere correctly, have given us so little to work with here? Why did they give us this enigma whom we would delight in making fun of and teasing? There has to be an answer to that question. Sometimes when you look at materials, you see the proposition, oh, the vice president was just an afterthought. You know, the carriage was waiting outside and they had to get home. Abigail had dinner on the table. And so they threw in a vice president at the last moment. I don't believe it for a minute. And in fact, when you take a little bit of the history, you discover that the vice presidency was modeled on a position in a state charter. You know, our founders were very clever people. They were very smart people. They were very well-read people in Montesquieu and Locke and Bracton and Blackstone and all the people who contribute to the great legal lineage that we teach here at Pepperdine in terms of constitutional law. But they also were, like all Pepperdine students, were looking for the template. Where's the model agreement that I can, work my magic from? And the template that the founders found were state charters, and in particular the Charter of New York, State Constitution of New York. And what do you see when you look at the State Constitution of New York? You see that there's a governor and a lieutenant governor. And you see that the lieutenant governor steps up for the governor whenever he's dead, he's been removed, or he's resigned. But also you see one other thing. You see a phenomenon at the state level where the lieutenant governor steps up on a more regular basis when the governor, for whatever reason, has decided not to act on that question. When he's out of the territory, when he's beyond the state line, for example. And so you see a proposition that the reason further definition was thought to be unnecessary at the state level for the lieutenant governor because they thought he was more regularly on call in the sense like we all have bosses from time to time who disappear and they say, well, you handle it. You're in charge today. You make up that determination. And in fact, having borrowed the lieutenant governor position into the vice president position, one of the things they did not contemplate is that, well, presidents weren't going to be traveling very much. At least at our initial founding, there wasn't air travel. Travel by ship wasn't going to be very much in the offing either. And it turns out, in terms of our own tradition, that we did not anticipate the fact that there wasn't a one-to-one correspondence between the life of a lieutenant governor and the life of a vice president. So one explanation for this lack of definition is just simply that the different nature of the positions was not fully comprehended, I think. That's a very instrumental thing. But there's also the second proposition, and that is that the powers in the vice president are united in ways that they are not united anywhere else. There's an executive legislative component to the vice president that is unique. Is that just accidental, or is that anomalous? I don't think it is. The normal tale that is told on this proposition is that it is anomalous, that the vice president is almost a violation of his own office. We think of the vice president colloquially as a deputy president. And indeed, the vice presidents that we honor modernly are vice presidents that seem to have taken hold of the executive reins in ways that augment the authority and the power and the decision-making capacity of the president. It is almost as if we had that co-president regime that Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford flirted with for a while. But there's a difficulty with that. As much as one can applaud that new energy, that greater energy in the vice presidency performing executive function, are we losing something by not paying closer attention to the fact that the framers chose to put executive and legislative responsibilities together? Are we in fact losing something in terms of the ability to get past a dysfunctional, paralyzed government by not seeing that we need an agent? We need a high office that basically can say to the president, you can't count on my vote, you have to win it. That says to the legislative branch, you can't count on my vote, you have to win it, you have to persuade me. And in that kind of dual competition for the vice president's vote, and remember where the vice president votes, he's denied a vote in all cases except in the case of a tie. And one can assume that in the case of a tie, it's a matter of some considerable importance and direction to the country. Either a key appointment or a key legislative decision. It's not an insignificant power that the founders have given to the vice presidency. It may be a power that's exercised rarely in modern times, but when it's exercised, it is very, very key. And isn't it interesting that maybe the founders just maybe contemplated that just as on the separation of powers side they created ambition that would check ambition, where the concern on the separation of powers side was how well you prevented another branch from encroaching or aggrandizing yourself. How much did you prevent the executive branch from taking over a legislation function or vice versa? And we know that's where the courts have been concentrated, on that side of the equation. But what about the other side? The side that enjoins not just separateness, but integration of the powers. Isn't there a need for a vice presidential office that could facilitate that taking place? Now, maybe it hasn't happened very much in our republic. But one of the things I think we'll learn from our historians today is that there have been a good number of occasions, from the earliest moment until the present, where vice presidents have indeed acted independently of their presidential counterparts, where they have voted against a nomination that the president has sent forward, where they have refused a diplomatic mission, in some cases where they've refused even to give opinion to matters to the president. Now you say to yourself, well, this is an interesting job. This guy is waiting around to replace the head guy, and he's not even helping the head guy in the operations of the office. And yet, if you think about that not helping, it's not helping in a mean-spirited way. It's not helping, but it's helping in a way of independence. It's helping in a way that says, this is a moment in time where both sides have to talk to each other or nothing will move forward. Now, it's a theory. That's all it is as to the plausibility of this being in the mind of the founders. What do we know is true about the dysfunction generally? We know that divided government, where the presidency is in one hand and the House or the Senate or both are in the other, has been a phenomenon modernly that has been very much behind the inability to control deficits, meet fiscal deadlines, to prepare adequately for matters of national security, even in some instances. And we forget how little our government was divided for the first 150 years, just by one statistic. From the 1880s to 1956, there were 17 presidential elections. In every one of those elections, the president coming into office had a united government. Coming into office, the political party of his preference was also in control of the House or the Senate. That has seldom, if ever, been the case in the last 50 years. So think about, what are the causes of that? And what are the possible antidotes to that, to divided government and its inability to act? I said this was a thought that occurred to me during my foreign service, and the reason it did was because I was in a country of a parliamentary democracy, a small country to be sure, but a country nevertheless that managed to very effectively meet its promises and its expectations. And one of the reasons it was able to do that was not just the unity of ministers between cabinet member and member of parliament, but also because in these democracies there typically was a division between a head of state and a head of government. And the head of state occupied a position that was truly nonpartisan, that was by tradition aimed at looking for the common good out of the common ground. Now this was an aspiration of our own first president. George Washington, you'll remember in his farewell address, said, "Be wary of the baneful effects of partisanship." So here's the irony, and here's the difficulty. We face this moment of dysfunction. Can we look to the Vice President to help us over that impasse? Can we look to the Vice President in the same way that these parliamentary democracies look to their head of state, their separate office that embodies the nobility and the ideals of the country, always looks to the best interests rather than just to the interests of particular ideology? That's a question. And if we've been relying upon political party which the initial founders found so antagonistic, do we now need more than ever to rely upon the vice presidency at this moment when partisanship has become so sharp, so divisive, and so hyper in its orientation? These are questions. There's not ready answers to it. There are not glib answers to it. They're answers that require thoughtful examination of history. And there's no one more thoughtful in that examination than our own Edward Larson, the darling professor of history and law here at Pepperdine University, someone who's a great colleague, who's rich in his understanding of every aspect of the Constitution and much, much more. And I yield the podium to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you for that, not just to me, but introduction for all of us. Welcome here. Let me add my welcome. All of you, our speakers and our guests here at Pepperdine. We love having you here on the most beautiful campus in America. Now, I've been asked, as just indicated, I've been asked to speak about the origins of and the early history of the Vice Presidency up to the 12th Amendment. You'll understand why it ends with the 12th Amendment by the time I'm done, I hope. In that way, I hope to answer some of the wonderful questions that were raised by Ambassador Kmiec. Now, as historian, with that task assigned to me, that means I tell a story. So let me begin. In its 1789 origins, the creation of an office of Vice President was an afterthought at the Constitutional Convention and reflected spectacularly little forethought. Some delegates dismissed it as a useless appendage, while others saw it as a constitutional mistake. And delegates, I mean delegates at the convention. Even its proponents at the convention did not claim that the office served a significant government purpose, but was rather defended by them as an electoral expedient. Let me explain. The idea of having a vice president first arose during the closing weeks of the Constitutional Convention after an ad hoc committee of 11 was appointed to resolve outstanding issues with the presidency. The Virginia Plan, which we all know served as the agreed starting point for the convention's deliberations, did not make any mention whatsoever of a vice president. Neither did the New Jersey Plan, nor the alternative proposals for a central government structure offered at the convention by Alexander Hamilton or Charles Pinckney. Further, during the extensive convention deliberations over the nature and the structure of the executive, which occurred at various occasions during June, July, and August of 1787, no issue occupied more time at the convention than the nature of the presidency. There was no mention whatsoever by any delegate of having a vice president. Indeed, on that date, on September 4th, when this committee reported, which was scarcely 2 weeks before the convention adjourned, the Committee of 11 recommended a redesigned scheme for electing the president by using electors that included having a vice president who would assume the office of the president for the remainder of a president's 4-year term should the incumbent die in, be removed from, or resign office. More than anything, it was the structure of how the president would be selected under the Committee of 11's proposal that resulted in having a vice president, though that new office was not essential to that committee structure. The Virginia Plan had called for the national legislature, Congress, to choose the executive for a fixed term, and the convention initially accepted that approach. Repeatedly, however, delegates raised concerns that having Congress choose the president, and this was alluded to by Ambassador Kmiec, particularly if the president could serve multiple terms in office, that this would undermine the independence of that office and frustrate the checks and balances among the branches that many delegates, following Montesquieu, thought was essential for preventing tyranny. Big state nationalists such as Pennsylvania's James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris favored the direct election of the president by voters, but Southern delegates feared that such an approach would disadvantage their states, whose large slave populations could not vote, while small state delegates were worried that it would concentrate power to select the president in 3 or 4 populous states. Various alternative methods for selecting the president were proposed at the convention over the course of the summer, including assigning the task to some sort of special electors. The idea actually came from how the Pope was chosen. Special electors chosen for that purpose, but none of those proposals, and there were several, could obtain or sustain majority support. though it remained in the back of the mind of Gouverneur Morris and others who would form this Committee of 11. One problem with electors, some delegates warned, was that they would favor candidates from their own state and no one would obtain a majority. When the Committee of 11 was appointed on August 31, the convention remained committed to Congress choosing the president, but many delegates had their doubts. Largely under the influence of Gouverneur Morris, who many thought was the brightest man at the convention, the Committee of 11 jettisoned legislative selection of the executive in favor of a complex method utilizing both state electors and Congress. To deal with the concerns of small states, each state would have the same number of electors as its members in the House of Representatives and Senate, which assured at least 3 electors for even the least populated state, while giving more weight to larger states. To deal with concerns of slave states, factoring House membership into the equation extended the 3/5 compromise to presidential selection, thus assuring more votes for slave states than under direct election, but not as much as under an approach that allocated power to the states based on the whole number of their free and enslaved people. In short, the Electoral College was a compromise. To address concerns expressed by various delegates that electors would favor candidates from their own state, the Committee of 11 proposed that each elector would cast 2 equal undesignated votes for 2 different candidates, only one of whom could come from the elector's home state. Even if every elector favored only candidates from their own state, this approach forced them to vote for at least one person from another state and thus allow national candidates to emerge from the elector's second votes. To win at this stage, a candidate would need to receive 1 vote from a majority of the electors, with the candidate receiving the most votes becoming president. If 2 candidates received the same number of votes from a majority of the electors, then Congress would choose between those 2. This convoluted, jerry-rigged compromise created an anomaly. What principled explanation was there for giving each elector 2 votes for president? We know the electoral reason, but what could be the reason you tell the public? The question could be answered if each elector was ultimately selecting 2 office holders. And so the committee added that the candidate receiving the second highest number of votes, even if they came from a minority of the electors, would hold a new office of vice president. This is the first suggestion of a vice president at the Philadelphia Convention. As Virginia delegate James Madison, and who is a better authority than James Madison, as he later explained when confronted with this question at his state's ratifying convention, he said, well, each had 2 votes because 1 vote was intended for the vice president. In this way, the vice presidency was created to serve an electoral rather than a government purpose. Having concocted a federal office with no real government purpose, the Committee on 11 needed to give its holders something to do. It proposed conferring 2 principal duties on the vice president that, taken together, proved problematic for some delegates. First, the committee proposed that the vice president would become president should that office become vacant during the incumbent's term of office. This suggested to some delegates an executive role for the vice president, but actually gave nothing for the office holders to do so long as the president remained in office. To supply some ongoing tasks, the committee proposed that the vice president preside over the Senate with the power to vote in case of a tie. This second duty suggested to some delegates a legislative role for the vice president that, when combined with the first role, raised a concern about mixing legislative and executive functions. Rushing toward adjournment, and evidently more concerned about the method for selecting the president than the creation of a high-sounding but insignificant office, delegates at the Constitutional Convention said remarkably little about the Committee of 11's recommendation relating to a vice president. It passed as part of the whole, but not before a telling exchange between 3 very harsh critics, future Vice President Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and Virginia delegates George Mason and Edmund Randolph, and 2 very defensive-sounding members of the Committee on 11, Roger Sherman, the great Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and North Carolina's Hugh Williamson. In his notes on the convention, Madison summarized the exchange as follows, and it's very telling. The third section, Vice President shall be ex officio President of the Senate, being thus considered. Mr. Jerry, I'm quoting from the different people as in Madison's notes, Mr. Jerry opposed this regulation. We might as well have put the President himself at the head of the legislature. The close intimacy that must subsist between the President and the Vice President makes it absolutely improper. He, meaning Jerry, is against having any Vice President. Mr. Sherman, member of the Committee of 11, remember. Mr. Sherman saw no danger in this case. If the Vice President were not President of the Senate, he would be without employment. Mr. Randolph, remember he had introduced the Virginia Plan. Mr. Randolph concurred in opposition to the clause. Mr. Williamson, member of the Committee of 11, observed, quote, that such an office of Vice President was not wanted. This is one of its proponents. Was not wanted. He was introduced merely for the sake of a valuable mode of election, which required two to be chosen at the same time. That's its proponent speaking. Colonel Mason thought the office of Vice President mixed too much the legislative and executive, which ought to be kept as separate as possible. That's the only exchange on the Vice Presidency we have from the Constitutional Convention. Then, on the question, shall the Vice President be ex officio President of the Senate, it passed 8 aye to 2 no. And so the Constitution created an office of Vice President that even one member of the Committee 11 conceded was, quote, not wanted, but introduced merely for the sake of a valuable mode of election, which required two to be chosen at one time. An afterthought at best, an electoral expedient at worst, no convention delegate affirmatively defended the office as needed. At most, Sherman saw no danger in it, though Jerry, Randolph, and Mason did, with both Jerry and Mason later citing it as one of several reasons why they refused to sign the Constitution at the convention. Surviving records of the debates at various state ratifying conventions suggest that the members attending those historic conclaves gave at most scant meaning or attention to the Vice Presidency, as little as the delegates had at the Constitutional Convention. Little is said about that office, and no one attributed much importance to it, though a few anti-federalists did take turns disparaging it. At Virginia's heated and closely drawn convention, for example, one future president, James Monroe, declared, quote, the Vice President is an unnecessary officer. I can see no reason for such an officer. Speaking at the same convention, George Mason added as follows, the Vice President appears to me not only as unnecessary, but dangerous. The legislative and executive are hereby mixed and incorporated together. I cannot, at this distance of time, foresee the consequences, but I think that in the course of human affairs, he will be made a tool in order to bring about his own interest and aid in overturning the liberties of this country. He didn't know how, but he was sure somehow it would be. Some members attending other state ratifying conventions also expressed concerns about the Vice Presidency mixing legislative and executive functions, but never in terms suggesting that this issue alone was decisive in leading them to oppose ratification. They had plenty of other reasons. This leaves a sense that the office simply did not matter much to the framers or ratifiers and was simply carried along with the rest of the Constitution to become part of the new government. Now, that's what we have in Origins. We get to the first Vice President. Straddling the executive and legislative branches, its first occupant, John Adams, was far from impressed with the post. Viewing the Vice Presidency as a legislative position and put off by Adams' Puritan officiousness, Washington did not seek or accept Adams' counsel during his administration, and even Adams readily admitted that he had no say on patronage and no influence in the administration. Focusing his attention instead on his legislative duties, which he attended to on a daily basis,
Adams initially joined in offering motions and debating measures in the Senate, but the senators soon tired of his interference and, by rule, limited the vice president's role to that of presiding officer. As such, Adams could not introduce legislation or speak to the merits of matters. In short, as biographer David McCullum concluded about Adams, quote, the role of the vice president made him a political cipher. After one term in it, Adams concluded in that famous quote that's already partly been used, quote, my country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man or his imagination conceived. A member of the first Congress joked that the office should carry the title, His Superfluous Excellency. For all practical purposes, the vice president, under the Constitution before the 12th Amendment, had neither executive authority nor substantial legislative power. Still, Adams appreciated that, as vice president, he was, as he once put it, quote, only one breath away from the presidency, that breath being Washington's, of course, and viewed himself as the general's likely successor. In letters during his term as vice president, Adams referred to himself, and I'm quoting here from his own letters, as, quote, the heir apparent, and as America's Prince of Wales. Although it proved true in his one case, this view looked back to how the framers had envisioned the vice presidency rather than forward to what it was becoming, and underscores how poorly they foresaw the future of American politics in their construction of the office. They conceived a presidential selection process in which independent electors rooted in the politics of their particular states would each vote for two people they viewed as best suited to be president of the United States, with the top vote getter gaining that post and the second place finisher serving as vice president. In such a case, the vice president would, in a certain sense, be a competitor and plausible heir to the president. Even in the first federal election, and much more so in the second, it became clear that electors implementing this system did so in a manner quite different from what the framers intended. From the outset, they cast one vote for president and another for vice president rather than two for president. In the 1788-89 election, every elector surely intended to vote for George Washington as president, and Adams or some other person as vice president. Indeed, fearful that so many electors might vote for both Washington and Adams in this manner that Adams could accidentally come out ahead of Washington in the final count, Federalist leader Alexander Hamilton actively encouraged some electors to scatter their second votes so as to ensure Washington won the presidency, which of course he readily did. It is hard to believe that Hamilton or many of the Federalists who voted for Adams actually viewed him as the heir apparent to the presidency or in any way comparable to Washington. Indeed, that's inconceivable, especially in the case of Hamilton. Quite to the contrary, Hamilton, we know from his letters, actually supported Adams for vice president to keep him from getting any more meaningful posts such as Chief Justice. There is no evidence that anyone at the convention foresaw using the vice presidency as a way to sidetrack rivals, yet Hamilton figured out how to use it in precisely that way in the very first election. By the second presidential election in 1792, a further unforeseen political development carried the electoral system even further from the framers' intention. National political factions had begun to replace state political considerations as the driving force in federal elections. As in the 1788-89 election, every elector voted for Washington as president. But by 1792, all but 5 of them, out of 132, so all but 5 out of 132 electors cast their other vote for the chosen vice presidential nominee of their faction, either Adams for the Nationalistic Federalist or New York Governor George Clinton, who was a former anti-federalist leader, for the states' right-minded Republicans. Electors had become pawns of national factions rather than independent agents. The partisan nature of the presidential election became fully apparent in 1798, the third election, after Washington declined to stand for a third term. In that election, electors in virtually every state were chosen based on their commitment to vote for the nominees of the two nascent political parties as chosen by their caucuses in Congress. The Federalists endorsed Adams for president and South Carolina's Thomas Pinckney for vice president. The Republicans countered with Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr of New York for vice president. Of course, the already antiquated electoral vote system did not allow electors to designate their votes for president or vice president. And so the parties could only obtain their intended outcome by having one or more of their electors scatter their second votes to someone other than the party's vice presidential nominee. The outcome was expected to be close in 1796. And in the end, the Federalists won by a scant 3 electoral vote margin, 71 to 68. By this point, alienated totally from Adams, Hamilton saw in the system an opportunity to bring in Pinckney ahead of Adams by having the South Carolinians' 8 home state electors, who would surely vote for Jefferson for president, cast their second votes for Pinckney rather than for Burr. If everything else played out as Hamilton planned, Pinckney would come in first, even though all the electors voting for him did so with the intention of him becoming vice president. You can do the math yourself. Pinckney would have 79 votes to 71 for Adams, even though no elector was voting for him as president. Adams' supporters got wind of the plot, however, and scattered so many of their second votes away from Pinckney that Jefferson, with uniform support from his 68 Republican electors, finished second and became vice president, even though every elector voting for him had voted for him with the intention that he become president. Clearly, the system was not working as either the framers or the emerging parties intended. The vice presidency lay at the heart of the problem. For once, however, the president and the vice president were true political rivals, and Jefferson spent his tenure in office undermining the administration from his post as presiding officer in the Senate. Speak about what Ambassador Kmiec was talking about, a vice president differing from the president. Well, it never happened more than during those 4 years. With the original electoral vote process already strained almost to the breaking point by the previous 3 contests, the election of 1800 added the last straw that brought down the old system. And through the resulting adoption of the 12th Amendment, fundamentally changed the vice presidency from an independent office to a partisan accessory to the presidency. The popular election in 1800, which featured an unprecedentedly bitter partisan campaign between Federalists and Republicans, that the latter won by a 1-state margin after narrowly switching the outcome in New York from 4 years earlier, would not have changed anything but for a misstep by Jefferson's forces. With the contest running close and not wanting Adams to slip into the vice presidency as Jefferson had in 1796, Republicans urged their electors to cast a unified ballot, while failing to direct any one of them to scatter their second vote. Accordingly, when the ballots were counted, Jefferson and Burr each had 73 votes. Even though every Republican elector had intended to vote for Jefferson as president and Burr as vice president, the election was thrown into the lame duck House of Representatives, where neither party controlled the majority of the state delegations. Hoping to strike a deal with Burr for their support, Federalists hung the House for 7 days through 35 ballots before letting Jefferson prevail after Republicans threatened civil war and disunion. These Federalist mechanisms underscored the failure of the constitutional provisions for electing the vice president. With Republicans taking control of both houses of Congress, an effort began almost immediately to amend the Constitution to provide for designation of electoral votes, one for president and one for vice president. Such a switch in the electoral vote process would institutionalize the shift to partisan tickets for federal office, with the vice president running in tandem behind the president as part of his or her team, and reduce the opportunity for a minority party to manipulate the system. Amending the Constitution requires a two-thirds majority of both houses, however, and with minority Federalists opposed to any change that would advantage their opponents, Republicans did not gain a sufficient majority to force through a change until after the midterm election of 1802. Then they acted. With a commanding 96 to 38 member majority, Republicans in the House of Representatives took up as one of their first orders of business a simple amendment providing for the designation of electoral votes, one for president, one for vice president. It passed the House over unified Federalist opposition in just 11 days. Victorious Republicans stressed how the old procedure was subject to anti-democratic manipulations, potentially resulting in the selection of a president that no elector voted for that post, as nearly happened in 1800. For example, Virginia Republican John Clapton told his colleagues, quote, "When one person is intended for an office and another person actually obtains it, such an election, if it indeed can be properly called an election, is not conformable with the will of those by whom it is made." In arguing against it, Federalists stressed that the amendment would denigrate the vice presidency by leading electors to cast one vote for a candidate suitably qualified to be president, and the other simply for someone sufficient to preside over the Senate. Reduced in this fashion to a mere partisan sinecure, as they called it, some Federalist representatives urged simply abolishing the office altogether. With a smaller majority than in the House, and one that included some friends of Burr who still presided over that body, Senate Republican leaders would need every vote they could get to pass the amendment and had to accommodate the interests of potential supporters. The process took longer than in the House, nearly 3 months of debate, and the incorporation of more matters into the amendment than simply designation, including the requirement that to be elected, the vice president as well as the president required votes from a majority of the electors. This addition was demanded by Republican Senator Stephen Bradley of Vermont, who warned that, quote, "Without it, designation would so diminish the vice presidency that it would be hawked about the market and given as change for votes for the presidency." The majority vote requirement did not cure the problem. However, Federalist Senator Uriah Tracy of Connecticut countered. It simply assured that the president and vice president would come from the same majority party, while busting, as he called it, the mystical and wonderfully existing system that by requiring electors to vote for two candidates for president without knowing who would prevail, encouraged voting only for highly qualified candidates. Small states would lose too under this arrangement, Tracy added, and coupled with the majority vote requirement, it would lead to the selection of a second-rate vice president from large states capable of delivering electoral votes for the party ticket. Certainly, Tracy correctly predicted the vice president nominations under the 12th Amendment would go to persons who could balance the party ticket and broaden its appeal. Though as such recent nominees as Joe Biden, Sarah Palin, or Dick Cheney show, those nominees need not come from large states. Federalist Senator Samuel White of Delaware proved more prophetic when he predicted on the Senate floor about the selection of vice presidential nominees, and there's his statement: "The question will not be asked, is he capable? Is he honest? But can he, by his name, by his connections, by his wealth, by his local situation, by his influence, or by his intrigues, best promote the election of the president?" As they had in the House, Republicans defended designation on the grounds that it would ensure that the majority party would elect the vice president and prevent a repeat of 1800, when the elector's intended candidate was nearly deprived of the presidency. They showed how someone put forward as vice president by electors could, without designation, become president. This, they charged, could destroy the Union. With time running out to get it ratified before the 1804 election, and taking advantage of two convenient absences from the floor that reduced the number required for a two-thirds majority by one, Senate Republicans passed the amendment without a vote to spare on December 2nd, 1803. Every single Federalist voted no. The House concurred with the Senate 6 days later, with the Speaker required to vote to supply the necessary two-thirds margin. Again, every Federalist member opposed it, this time with Massachusetts Federalist Representative Samuel Taggart repeating the now familiar charge that the amendment would, quote, reduce the vice president to be a mere tool of the president. Sent to the states for ratification in December 1803 with President Thomas Jefferson's full endorsement, the amendment gained the support of the required 3/4 of the states by the end of July 1804, 7 months, in time to govern the 1804 election. In state after state, the amendment was ratified by the legislatures on the grounds that would help assure that, in a republic, the voice of the majority should prevail. Whether the verdict was correct or not, the 12th Amendment became part of the Constitution, and the ground was laid for the modern vice presidency as the rear rider pedaling, but not steering, a tandem bike. Tellingly, in 1804, George Clinton became the first post-12th Amendment vice president after having declined to run for an 8th term as governor of New York on the grounds of his advanced age and poor health. At 65, he saw the vice presidency, I'm using those words, as an ideal retirement job because it required little work and left so much time for recreation. Clinton was elected to office twice, once running with Jefferson and once with Madison, but died during the second term. He was succeeded as Madison's vice president at the next election by 68-year-old Elderbridge Gerry, who had opposed creation of the office at the Constitutional Convention and passed away less than 2 years after assuming it. Given their age, neither man was viewed as an heir apparent or competitor to the president, but did play a role in balancing the party ticket as a big state northerner running with a Virginia slaveholder. As intended, the 12th Amendment had brought American politics and the vice presidency more in line with how those institutions had already been evolving. First, as stressed during the congressional debate over it, the amendment fit the national government's emerging two-party structure so that both the president and the vice president would be chosen from the same majority party. Second, except for leaving the office with ministerial and tie-breaking role in the Senate, by having the vice president chosen on a partisan ticket with the president, the amendment effectively moved the office from the legislative to the executive branch. With its ratification, the modern, national, American political structure was complete, and since that time, we have operated and evolved from that basic structure. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again, Dr. Larson, for that excellent presentation. As you've seen just a little bit this morning, Dr. Larson is both a gifted historian and storyteller, and we are honored to have him here at Pepperdine. So before we welcome our next speakers as they make their way up to the stage, I'm going to ask that our law review staffers now circulate along the aisles to collect any questions that are written on index cards. If you pass those to the outer edges of the aisle, our staffers will collect those. And I know we have a few classes that are now entering quietly. And while that takes place, I want to introduce each of our keynote speakers for this exciting panel that we're about to begin. Beginning first with former Attorney General Ed Meese. For over 25 years, Mr. Edwin Meese has worked with the Heritage Foundation, where he serves as the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus. In that capacity, Mr. Meese has made invaluable contributions to the nation's understanding of constitutional law and has sought to educate government officials, the media, and the public about the Constitution and legal principles, and most importantly, how they affect public policy. In 2005, Mr. Meese headed the Heritage Foundation Legal Center's advisory board in the writing and editing of the best-selling book, The Heritage Guide to the Constitution, a clause-by-clause constitutional guide compiled from contributions of over 100 different scholars and practitioners. It continues to be an essential tool for study of constitutional law and principles and is frequently used in law schools across the country, including here at Pepperdine. He is perhaps best known as the U.S. Attorney General during Reagan's second term, and Mr. Meese's service to that conservative icon stretched from the California governor's mansion in 1966 all the way to the White House in 1981. Mr. Meese is the author of several other books, including Leadership, Ethics, and Policing, Making America Safer, and With Reagan, The Inside Story. He is a prominent conservative leader, thinker, and an elder statesman, and we are honored to have him here today. Our keynote speaker is a man who needs no introduction. Vice President Dick Cheney served as vice president under George W. Bush, and as a statesman, policymaker, businessman, and politician, Vice President Cheney's service and experience are nearly unparalleled. As White House Chief of Staff in the aftermath of Watergate, then as a Wyoming congressman and member of the House Republican leadership during the Reagan years, as both Secretary of Defense in the Persian Gulf War in Operation Desert Storm, and as the former CEO of Halliburton, Vice President Cheney has participated in many of the events that have shaped our nation for over 4 decades, and he is a key figure in this nation's history. He has also authored several best-selling books, including In My Time, a personal and political memoir, and most recently, Exceptional, Why the World Needs a Powerful America. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel, former Attorney General Edwin Meese, our moderator, Ambassador Doug Kmiec, and Vice President Dick Cheney.
Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get right to it. We've heard a presentation from Dr. Larson that suggests that your role, Mr. Vice President, was not thought highly of, that it was a political expedient, that it was a prize that could be given away to earn some political credit for the president. We saw some interesting manipulations going on in the Electoral College where people were, under the original system, casting their ballots in a way where so many people would cast ballots that an unexpected presidential candidate would emerge out of votes cast for vice president because they were undesignated votes originally. First of all, what do you make of that history? Is it a history that you're comfortable with, or do you find yourself dissenting from it?
I thought it was eloquent and right on. I must admit I'm guided a bit. My wife has written a book on James Madison, and part of that obviously covers his role in the drafting of the Constitution and so forth. But the impression that Dr. Larson presented here today is very much in tune with you, if you will, with my wife's interpretation of those events. Not that she has, she does in fact carry greater weight with me than most people. But it's, I think it was an afterthought. I think it was partly an effort to try to deal with some of the problems that arose as they put together the Electoral College, and the fact that you had a couple of prominent members of the Constitutional Convention refused to sign the Constitution because of the flaws they saw, issues that hadn't been addressed with respect to the creation of vice presidency. I think it was indeed a band-aid, an effort to deal with the short-term problem, and the rationale behind it at the time was pretty much unformed.
You know, when you get into this, you rather quickly discover how much the vice presidency is tied up with this conception of the Electoral College and the changes that take place in it. One also discovers a supposition from our first president, who, of course, receives kit glove treatment oftentimes as the saint of the Republic, who viewed the entire operation of government in a nonpartisan way, as I said, in terms of his farewell address. He warned us very strenuously about the baneful effects of party. And when you asked Washington for his conception of his role of the presidency, it's much different than the role that we associate with the president now. We associate with the president being the head of his party, We associate the presidency with being a national leader in terms of laying out a policy program that he will ask the Congress to follow on behalf of the constituents that have elected him, on behalf of all the American people. Washington's conception of the presidency was much narrower than that. It was really quite managerial. It was executive. In fact, Washington and Madison, to some degree, resented the fact that members of Congress would ask the executive branch for their opinions on certain matters. Madison writes that he worked assiduously to prevent members of his administration from answering those letters. Now, we all have been in the executive administration. We had different reasons for not answering letters from Congress. But the Madison supposition was that was confusing the functions of the branches, that the president was to take what was delivered to him and to take care that the laws were faithfully executed. If you have that as an assumption of the nature of the presidency, and you have our first president being so nonpartisan, does it make sense to think of the vice presidency as something maybe that there was more going on than just merely a jewel to be added to somebody's political treasure box?
Well, one of the things I remember, and I think I've got it correct, there was a little bit of confusion, if you will, between what the executive role was going to be. It was clearly in the developmental stages. You look at Washington's first address to the Congress, message to the Congress. He had Madison, who's the leading figure in the Congress, write it for him. And then it was submitted by the President to the Congress. Madison, in his capacity as congressional leader, wrote the congressional response to the executive's message, which he had written himself originally. And then again, Washington used him to respond to that message. The confusion about who's writing whom and what messages being done was certainly blurred at that point. They operated based on the way that they were comfortable with. But you can imagine today if the President of the United States called on the congressional leader to write his State of the Union to the Congress. They were making it up as they went along to some extent.
Wasn't the political climate at that time, though, such a reaction to George III? And the idea of a strong executive was one of the great concerns they had in terms of having too much power in the presidency was kind of a backdrop to a lot of the thinking of many of the people there at the Constitutional Convention. And of course, up until that time, there had been no executive. They'd had Congress before, going all the way back to 1776 or so, or even before that, the Continental Congress. But the idea of an executive in this country having a lot of power is something that bothered a lot of the participants there.
I think that's right, Mr. Attorney General. One sees in, even with this, I mentioned how the framers used the state constitutions as a model. You know, when they did that, they discovered, of course, they weren't really fond of the state executives, because those state executives were appointees of the Crown. They were very much resented and resisted. Now, post-Declaration of Independence, it became a little bit different because, of course, then you had popular sovereignty and you had at least some portion of the population, freeholders and so forth, selecting the governor. But you're quite right that there was this profound concern with abuse of power and this unity of power, which brings us to we can jump forward a bit to the thing I mentioned in the introduction, and that is there's this perception out there in the land, maybe somewhat explanatory for some of the votes we've seen in the primary. Something has to explain the votes we've seen in the primary. That there's a certain rage among the people that the government is just simply not on the job. When they, you know, and I don't mean this to be in any way partisan, because I think it's kind of a bipartisan exercise. That key appointments in both administrations, a lot of times judicial appointments. I can remember complaining when I worked for you, sir, about the slow process of confirmation proceedings and the neglect of the Senate with handling those matters. Of course, now the shoe's on the other foot. President Obama is making that complaint. These things can be troubling from a kind of general public perspective of, well, why isn't the government delivering what those guys promised to me when they ran out on the stump, 4 years ago. But from a more intellectual or day-to-day perspective, it's even threatening to the separation of powers, Mr. Attorney General, that you mentioned, is it not? If you have key appointments not being made, if you have legislation not being addressed, there's a tendency on the part of the presidency to go around the problem, issue executive orders that you don't have authority for in place of legislation, pursue recess appointments that you don't have authority for, and so forth. So the separation of powers then itself becomes its own victim. So my question is this dysfunction issue a serious one, or would you describe it in a different way?
Well, I'm not sure how much it has to do with the role of the vice president, I guess.
We'll work on that one.
We'll get there. Yeah, I think there's great frustration out there in the country that is being tapped into for political reasons, for example, by Donald Trump. He's not the only one. We end up on the Republican side now with candidates running, and out of what we thought was a rich field of new talent, what we're left with at this stage, all of those supposedly establishment-style candidates aren't really a factor anymore. So it's taken on a different tone and a different style than I've ever seen the president.
I think the thing it has, the way I would argue that it has something to do with the vice presidency is this, and that is you mentioned, and Ed, you mentioned as well, that we were, even on the issue of the presidency as to what he was to do or she was to do, there was uncertainty about that. They were feeling their way. This was a new office. They didn't want a king. They wanted leadership. They wanted management, but they didn't know how much. And the problems get even more confused with the vice presidency. But one of the things that I think commends inquiry is how does the problem of reuniting the powers into an effective government, this admonition from Robert Jackson that you know comes from the Youngstown case, where he says the powers are meant not just to be divided and separated, but they are meant to be interspersed and integrated when necessary to perform a working government. If this vice president, who has this unique role of being both a legislative officer and a potential executive function, isn't the place where these two interests that have to meet, what substitute is there for getting agreement to move the government forward in a positive way?
Well, the way I look at it, based on my own experience, I was reputed by some to have an especially powerful position as vice president relative to the one.
Well, I think the president said, when you hear Dick Cheney's voice, you hear mine. I think that was probably...
That was a big part of it. But
it was an endorsement, I think.
I often think about why it worked the way it did on my watch. And I think of a lot of reasons, but none of them really relate to the Constitution or to the...
More of a personal dynamic?
Personal. Very much personal. I mean, it's my ability to work with the Congress. I'd been a member of the House for 10 years. I'd been part of the leadership for 8 years. Shortly after I was elected vice president, I was visited by the Speaker of the House and the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. The Speaker of the House was a good friend. I'd helped him when he first came into the Congress. Denny Hastert, Bill Thomas, California, was the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And they came to me and said, look, Dick, we know you're going to be the president of the Senate, constitutional, and you're going to have an office on the Senate side of the Capitol building, but we think of you as a man of the House. And we want you to also have an office on the House side of the Capitol. And the Ways and Means chairman at that point had two very nice offices. One facing the west front. You could look out the windows all the way to the Lincoln Memorial in Arlington. huge office, bigger table than the cabinet table. Or the other one he had was a smaller normal office, but right off the Democratic cloakroom, off the House floor. And they gave me my choice, and that I could have either one of those offices, even though I'm the President of the Senate. But because of my background in the House and my relationships, I picked the office right off the Democratic cloakroom, partly because I knew it aggravated my Democratic colleagues. But that's the only time that's ever happened. But for 6 years that we controlled the House, I had an office not only on the Senate side, not only down in the West Wing, but also on the House side of the Capitol, and was able to work from that position to break some log jams on tax legislation and so forth, and had a significant legislative impact when it was required. But that was really all based upon personal relationships and my past background with both the House and the Senate side of the Capitol.
Well, not meaning to understate that, I think that's a great story, by the way, and I think that's a very illustrative story as to the significance of the Vice President, but I want to give a little credit to the framers. This afterthought that they created got you that budget line and that office to some degree because it opened the door to the fact that you were going to be the President of the Senate. And yes, it was Dick Cheney that took the presidency of the Senate and found the most aggravating office to occupy and found ways in which to have conversations with respect to tax and other important legislation. But isn't that interesting that this office that they created that has been called a sinecure and has been called, just this bauble for folks who are looking for some political reward, so instrumental in terms of what you would point out to be your success as Vice President during your term of office? I think I think the framers get a little tip of the hat for that, don't you?
Well, perhaps, but I was also duck hunting buddies with Bill Frist.
Well, as a matter of fact, didn't you have, in the White House, you had the office in the White House in the West Wing. Also, you had the office in the office building, I believe, didn't you? So they could never find you.
Good point.
I don't think.
Looking at the vice presidency as it's come down through the years, as recently as Calvin Coolidge, I don't think there was much thought of the vice president having a big role in the executive branch, if I remember my history correctly. But really, when Eisenhower came in, he was used to a military structure, and he I think talked about Nixon becoming kind of an executive vice president, and there was discussion of that where the vice president would have more of a role in the executive branch than they had up to that. Is that about your recollection of how that office kind of changed at that point and has been more involved really with the executive since that time?
I think so, and it clearly has evolved over time. Prior to the time I got the job, and one of the reasons I said no when it was first offered was I'd never met a vice president who was happy. There were those who'd ultimately succeeded to the presidency for one reason or another, and Harry Truman and others who went on to distinguished careers because they became president. But I remember, when I was Ford's chief of staff, Nelson Rockefeller was vice president. Very unhappy because he had plans for operating as vice president of Wade Operators Government of New York. Big projects, lots of money, and we were in a period of time when our policy was no new starts. We're trying to save money, reduce the deficit. And he eventually left and was never happy. And allegedly, there's a report that he once said the only way he'd serve as vice president in a second, fourth term was if he could also be White House chief of staff. That was the job he really aspired to in terms of getting things done. And
Didn't get a chance to prove that proposition.
no, because he lost the vice presidency. Was removed and went on to other things. But
He wasn't even the candidate for vice president.
no. And it was, I was never a candidate for vice president until George Bush finally nominated me after he persuaded me that I should go on the ticket. But I think in recent administrations, I go back, I think, to the Carter-Mondale relationship, I think was a step up, if you will, in terms of the degree to which they worked closely together. Mondale played a more prominent role and was the historical one. I think that obviously continued in my case, and with respect to Joe Biden now, I don't know enough yet about the details of how Joe's functioning, but clearly in recent decades, there's been an enhancement of the power, the responsibility, the influence of Vice President.
Well, in fact, you're quoted, the story is told of you meeting with Vice President Quayle, where Vice President Quayle tells you that, well, be prepared to take a lot of foreign trips, do a lot of ceremonial duties, and raise some money for the party or for the president. And I think your terse response was, I have a different conception of the office.
Different understanding.
And that understanding, since we're in a law school, is going to run into a little headwind, because one of those understandings is, we've got those 15 words in the Constitution that says the executive power is vested in the President of the United States. And the late Justice Scalia, who dissented more than once in a separation of powers case, was fond of saying that meant all of the executive power was vested in the President of the United States. Not that you should lose a lot of sleep over these legal niceties, but did during your vice presidential service, did you think you were stepping outside of your constitutional role?
Well, Nino Scalia was also a duck hunting buddy. No, I did. Obviously, there were times when I played a significant role, but the thing to remember is that's what the president wanted. The reason it worked as well as it did for the two of us, he had spent an amazing amount of time, more than I'd ever seen any other president do, an amazing amount of time thinking about the vice presidency. To the point that I had discovered years later, after I left office, that in 1992, when I was Secretary of Defense, and his dad was running for re-election, that he had gone to his dad, 41, and suggested to him that he make a change in his running mate, and that he replaced Dan Quayle with me as the candidate for vice president. This is back 8 years before he himself had to pick a vice president. So 8 years before, he'd been thinking about who ought to be vice president in his dad's administration, and he actually made that recommendation, which obviously was not accepted. But he was, he had a very, I think, carefully thought out plan on what it was he wanted to be vice president. I got involved in it. To say, when they first approached me about being vice president, I said no. I was happy in the private sector. I had no desire at all to become vice president. Then he asked me to help him find somebody, and we worked through about a 2 or 3 month process where I was running the search, vetting the various candidates and so forth. But also what it did, I think it was deliberate on his part, he never took that first no for an answer. And he thought if he could get me involved in working with him as he talked about what he was looking for, as he conveyed to me what I should be looking for in terms of a candidate, I absorbed his perception of how he wanted the office to work. When we got all through with the search, and I'd offered up everybody I could think of, I was obviously a failure as a headhunter. He turned to me and he said, you're the solution to my problem. And he persuaded me that I was what he needed, and that's where the ultimate agreement came from. There was never a contract or even a handshake on how it was all going to work. We just talked about it enough while I'm doing the search, so I had a good understanding of what he was looking for. And he obviously had decided sometime before that if he had a chance to pick a vice president, I was the person
But it's fair to say that no other vice president had had the experience that you've had in both branches.
It's true.
And so that there was in fact, his idea of the vice president was, you were kind of the model, whether he mentioned that directly or not. And so it was natural that he sucked you into the thing so that you finally became not just the model, but the candidate.
Although it is true, Ed, that I think you've identified a set of experiences, that executive and legislative mix that is unique among, especially for our honored guests today. But the other people that are pointed out are people with legislative experience. That legislative experience, even if they didn't have the additional executive experience that you were able to enjoy as well, but like Lyndon Johnson, for example, in terms of his effectiveness as president, drawing upon those legislative talents. Although we heard from Professor Larson that when Adams, tried to throw himself into his work, it was a little bit too much for the Senate to have him be there on a day-to-day basis. I will say that obviously George W. Bush was more persuasive than Zachary Taylor, who tried to get Daniel Webster to take the vice presidency. And you may remember his quip was, "No, sir, I will not take the vice presidency. I prefer to be dead before I'm buried."
That would have been my opinion before.
Now, you did have putting aside for a moment the legal niceties of what is and is not vested in the president, even if your particular president wants to overlook those legal niceties. You did do something that other vice presidents haven't done, and that is submit a letter of resignation. And that's an interesting thing to do, because one of the things you were astutely recognizing was that for the president to be able to be serene in his understanding that he had control in a unitary executive sense of the executive branch, he needs the ability to dismiss someone if necessary. And of course, vice presidents who disagree with their presidents can't usually be dismissed unless they've been as thoughtful as you were, was to keep a letter of resignation in the packet. Did you have occasion to disagree with the president from time to time?
Sure, we had our differences.
Give us an example or two.
Well, think of
You mentioned the amicus brief, but I take it that way.
in terms of disagreements, there were occasions when we had differences of view. Part of the process we had were weekly lunches, and that was the time that was always strictly just one-on-one with the president, and we could talk about anything. He'd express disagreement. A lot of those were and still remain private. It was important to have that ability to have it private. There were other occasions where we disagreed. I'm trying to think. Well, for example, when we got into the debate, we had discovered in the spring of '07, I'd been visited by Meyer Dagan, head of the Israeli Mossad. Steve Hadley and I received him. And he came in and started throwing colored photographs down on the table that were pictures taken inside a nuclear reactor that had been built at Al-Kabar in the eastern Syrian desert by the North Koreans. That was quite a surprise. The North Koreans, some months before, had tested their first nuclear device. And all of a sudden we find several months later that not only had they been, we knew they'd been working on a nuclear device, but they built a complete nuclear reactor for the Syrians. It hadn't been fueled yet. It was a major concern in terms of proliferation. The place where it was located is a part now controlled by ISIS. The prospects there were pretty disturbing. What ultimately happened was the Israelis went in and took it out. Exactly the right thing for the Israelis to do. The difference of opinion was I wanted us to take it out. My argument was that it was very important the U.S. Managed to back up what we'd said repeatedly, which was that we were opposed to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And we had taken such a strong position, it was important we back it up. And I was the only one in the administration who held that view. President, actually, we had a meeting upstairs in the residence of basically the National Security Council, and he allowed me to make my pitch. I'd had a private conversation before. He encouraged me to lay out the rationale for why the United States ought to be the one that took the action of destroying the North Korean-built reactor. And then he asked for a show of hands. How many of the members of the National Security Council agreed with that? And nobody. Nobody agreed with me. I still think it was the right thing to have done. I think it would have given real meaning and substance to our strong statements about avoiding nuclear proliferation. The discovery of that reactor and the Israeli action taking it out, sent a very strong signal to the area. I still would argue that I had the better policy option. He was the president, and obviously he did what he wanted to do.
And you made that argument entirely internally. You
I didn't go out publicly.
go outside with it.
Although it got out eventually. We differed over that. That wasn't a secret.
Right.
But it was, for the time being, we didn't talk about it. It was several months before we even acknowledged that there had been a nuclear reactor pursued.
Now, we heard the history of the Electoral College and the way it changed from where you cast two undifferentiated votes to two votes, one vote for the president, one vote for the vice president. The original method was said to attract men of equal stature, so that the person who received the second highest number of votes, who became vice president, was really a contestant, of course, for the presidency, and was of the same, thought of in the same range of talent and stature and maturity. And Jefferson himself would point that out from time to time. When the system changed so that you ran on separate ballots, then you sort of created a second tier. The fear was you were creating a second tier of people who would be aiming at that second office only, and therefore you would attract a different quality of people. In fact, Professor Larson got a laugh or two when he described somebody who said it was the perfect retirement spot and nobody will bother me and so forth. Your example just now illustrates that you had kind of enough substance, personal gumption to take on the President of the United States, even when you were the only voice in the context of the cabinet. How does a presidential candidate find that quality, I take it, which you would put high on the list of qualities for the vice president? What other qualities in selecting a vice president would you hold out to us?
I think, and I've argued before, lots of times the reasons people, presidents pick running mates, might have to do with gender or race or geography. I think there's only one criteria that matters more than all the others put together, and that's the capacity of the individual to be president of the United States, to take over and perform. And I think if we look back at history, we'll find that there have been a number of selections made over the years where clearly the vice presidential designate doesn't meet that requirement. There are a lot of pressures that come to bear at that time. Basically, I ran 2 searches for vice presidents. I did it once for Jerry Ford after Rockefeller stepped down in '76. We then had to have a replacement for the convention that summer. And I ran that search based on guidance from Jerry Ford. And then, of course, did it for President George W. Bush several years later.
The qualities necessary to step in at any given moment, is it breadth of experience? Is it
I think it's
adherence to the
experience.
cardinal
It
virtues?
has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Obviously, a certain degree of compatibility. President, the Vice President. One of the things, another thing that was important, I think, in terms of my role and my ability to operate was I'd taken myself out of contention for the presidency. It was very clear that I was not using the Vice Presidency to be a stepping stone to becoming a candidate myself. Because back in '93, after I left the Defense Department, I'd seriously considered running for president. Set up a PAC, did 160 campaigns and then elections. But I concluded after it was all over with that I would not run for president. Part of that was health related. By the time I'd gotten to that point, I'd had 3 heart attacks, quadruple coronary bypass. I was fearful that if I got into a campaign, which was a long shot anyway, and I lost, but it was tied in with my heart, that I'd immediately be labeled as the guy who lost because he had a bad heart. That would put a real crimp on future prospects with respect to business or anything else I might want to do. And so I decided not to be a candidate. And I never changed in that. But one of the reasons I think George Bush was comfortable with me and gave me as much latitude as he did was because he knew I wasn't worried about what my standing was going to be in the Iowa caucuses 4 years hence, because I wasn't going to be running. I'd already taken myself out of the run. And I think that was a very important part of building the degree of trust you had to have, not only with the president, but with the staff, and also the folks on Capitol Hill knew what I said was something I really believed, or I was speaking with the president. It wasn't because I was trying to influence the outcome of the Iowa caucuses 4 years hence.
Just want to remind the panelists, if they have questions, they're welcome to interject with a question. And the same for the audience in terms of cards and so forth. I see cards are coming. Because I have an inexhaustible supply of questions in my head. 2 that I want to go to before turning to the cards. One is for you, Mr. Attorney General. We've got this anomalous officer, this legislative branch person, hearing these confidential discussions in the executive branch. We know that as a matter of law, executive privilege depends upon maintaining that privilege and confidentiality so that you really can't defend executive privilege once something is outside the perimeter of the executive branch. How do we handle this difficulty when right in the middle of it is this person who's formally not part of the executive branch in an active sense, but only in a waiting sense, and is more in the nature of a legislative officer? Is there not a serious constitutional fly in the ointment on that one?
Well, people could conjure up one, but I think the idea of the separation of powers as being 2 or 3 walled separations, 2 separations among is a wrong concept. The separation of powers was the idea that you would have, that power would be dispersed among 3 bodies, but not that the 2 bodies, 2 out of those bodies couldn't require further limitation on power by requiring 2 of them to agree in order to have something done by the government. In other words, the whole concept behind the founders was to limit power. They found the key to having executive ability to do things, but at the same time not lose the liberty of the people and not have oppression and so they found the key was limiting power. So when they limited power among 3 branches and then further limited even each branch to operate individually on some things, such as legislation requiring 2 branches to cooperate, or as here, really allowing the president to determine what executive powers, if any, the vice president had. And that's why they said in Article 2, all executive powers launched in the president. And it didn't say the president and the vice president. So what the vice president here has been saying is that his power as vice president and of an executive nature depended upon what the president delegated to him. And so I don't think that I think that if anything, the thoughts of the founders were exactly in line with what they intended to do, and that was to limit power.
So the branches are not hermetically sealed, as we would say, and
There was no firewall, as we would call it today, between the branches in that sense.
so in that sense, we're, again, the vice presidency, whether you want to call it an afterthought or fortuitous circumstance, by uniting those two roles to some degree encourages that interpretation of cooperation.
Well, it may have been an accident of the manipulations of the electoral college and all that sort of thing, but if we didn't have a vice president, what would you do? And we've had numerous incidents over the years where the president, something happened to the president for one reason or another. If you didn't have a vice president, what would you do? Would you turn to the unelected, totally unelected Secretary of State as the primary, as the first among equals, I guess we'd call it, of the cabinet officers? How would you fill that gap?
It's that in itself is has been the line of succession, as we know, thanks to Alexander Haig. We'll always have a vibrant memory of, has changed several times.
Well, but of course he was wrong.
Yes, I remember. That's why we have a memory of it.
And the Speaker of the House is next in line after the Vice President. So if there were no Vice President, it would be the Speaker of the House. Then you would have a person who was elected by at most the citizens of one state or one congressional district becoming the President, with probably the lowest electoral majority anybody would have to be the head of a great country.
Well, and as you pointed out, you keep going, you go to the cabinet officers and you have people not elected by anyone. There's a question we do have from the audience, which I think is a good one. It says, since 1940, presidential candidates have chosen their vice presidential candidate on their own or sometimes in consultation, as you described, Mr. Vice President, with close political advisors. Is that enough accountability in a democratic sense, or should there be an alternative, such as a primary for vice presidents in and of themselves, or perhaps opening it up to the larger convention where the delegates to the convention would choose the vice president maybe from a list that the president narrowed down to 3 or something of that nature? What's your own thought on accountability and the selection of the vice president?
I guess I feel the ability of the vice president to really contribute, to be active and effective, turns ultimately upon what the president wants. Think of Lyndon Johnson. Here's a guy who's a legislative genius, king of the Senate, could get anything done as the Senate leader. And then the Kennedy administration made him vice president and absolutely cut his legs off. What you remember about Lyndon Johnson's vice presidency is he got to go to Afghanistan before there was a war, and he came home with a camel driver. It was a major story. Everybody here today wasn't born then, but it was a classic
You
case.
can lead the camel to water, Wilbur.
Yeah, well, maybe. But it was a classic case of a very powerful, very competent, very experienced man who'd been running the Senate very effectively, and once he became vice president, he had almost nothing to do because that's what the Kennedys were prepared to share with him. So when we start to tamper with the process and say, well, maybe the convention ought to choose, ultimately, for him to be effective, it has to be with the approval and support of the president. And it doesn't matter how else he may be selected. I'm not sure you're going to get something to make enough difference. In the final analysis, you may say the president did not pick well for vice president. Well, that's a judgment on the president. But if he is not satisfied and happy with that choice, that individual is going to be relegated to duties of attending funerals and fundraisers.
I don't know how much your lovely wife's book on Madison covers the number of times vice presidents went their own way from the president, but I was surprised as I dug into the history to find all of these examples of vice presidents casting a vote against a presidential nominee, casting a vote against a presidential program. Now, most of that happened in the 19th century, but some of it was, closer to today. Is that a part of the vice presidency that we're overlooking in terms of its constitutional significance, the ability to not necessarily count on that vice presidential vote when you send him over there to handle the tie?
Well, it certainly would put a strain on the relationship. One time fairly recently, I remember Nelson Rockefeller, when the debate in the Senate had to do with reducing the number of senators that it would take to break a filibuster. And Rockefeller got actively involved as vice president in the chair, taking a position that not that Ford was necessarily opposed to, but Ford hadn't been involved in, and didn't really want to be involved in it. Nelson Rockefeller went and got very actively involved. I think he even addressed the chamber, the Senate. And in the final analysis, he ended up having to go back and apologize to the Senate for his conduct. He was very much out there on his own. And so it's, it can happen. Again, you've got to be wise enough to know when to be maybe a little more aggressive, or a little far afield from the boss. And in the final analysis, the president's the president, and you can go over and jump off the boat, head in a totally different direction, be at odds with the administration. It's probably not a good idea. And it's, in the end, it's the president's administration. He's the one that way.
I think the greater danger, as far as the country is concerned, is where the president doesn't take the vice president into his confidences. There is a story, at least, I don't know whether it's true or not, that Truman did not know about the atomic bomb until he became president. And it seems to me that in terms of lack of preparation for the presidency, that's a rather extreme case of a president not advising the vice president of what was going on. And fortunately, I think since that time, there have been very few situations where the president and the vice president have not had as close a connection as they might.
Now, we recently had some published remarks by Bush 41 about your role and Mr. Rumsfeld's role. This public television may be listening, so we'll use Ferris Bottom as the way to describe the characterization.
Iron ass.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much. And I know you think very highly of the elder President Bush, and I'm not looking for your reaction necessarily to that particular comment, other than to ask you, as you reflect on your own vice presidency, are there some things you would have done differently?
Right offhand, I can't think of any. But no, it's a fascinating story. It's John Meacham's book. It's a great book about biography of 41, George H.W. Bush. During the course of that, in a conversation with the president, President Bush Sr. made the comment that I had undergone a change from when I'd been his defense secretary until I became his son's vice president.
And he attributed it to 9/11.
I attributed it to 9/11.
Okay.
I think he did too, but there's no question about it. I became much more aggressive and hard-nosed, iron-ass, however you want to describe it, in the aftermath of 9/11, because it was not a law enforcement problem the way it had always been treated in the past. It was an act of war, worst attack ever on the homeland, and I spent a good part of my time as vice president doing everything I could think of to make certain it didn't happen again. I got the guys that have done it, that we established the procedures, counterterrorism policy. And I admitted that he was right in terms of his assessment. I got a very nice note from him afterwards saying, "Dick, I did it, and then went on to say some very nice things about our association. And then the other thing that happened was that Alpha Club, that's been in business for over 100 years in Washington. You're asked to join. We meet once a year, and lots of laughs, jokes, and so forth. But 41 loved Alpha Club, and he came this year, even though he's in a wheelchair and not in good health. But I got an invitation to sit next to him at the head table. The Alpha was sort of a way, I think, to smooth over the relationship and convey the message that there was no hard feelings on either side.
Now, there's a few questions here that go a little bit beyond the vice presidential topic, but it's an opportunity to have your thoughts, and I think it would be good to do that. Would either of you like to reflect on the recent passing of Nancy Reagan and what she meant to former president, the late President Reagan? And
Ed would be the expert on that.
Well, the one thing I will say is she didn't try to usurp the powers of the vice president. Because there was an awful lot of talk about her being the voice behind the throne, that sort of thing, which really was not true.
she didn't have Don Regan fired?
No, she didn't have him fired. Let's say they didn't get along well, and the president decided it would probably be better that he found other work. But no, Nancy Reagan was a very good wife, devoted to her husband, tremendous source of strength to him. But I never, in 8 years as president's legal advisor and chief of staff in California, and then 8 years as the presidency, I can't have any, there was not one instance where she tried to interfere in policy or in anything, or in any improper way tried to influence what was going on in government. Now, there's no doubt she had definite ideas, and if she was a good wife, she'd probably talk to him at night on some of those things. She was very alert to people that she didn't think were serving him well, and she let him know that. The main thing she was concerned about, quite frankly, was that as the oldest living president at that time, I mean the oldest president in office at that time, that he didn't get overtired or do other things, travel too much, or things that would keep him from being a highly competent and highly effective president. And that was the one time she would call over to the Oval Office or to the White House office and talk about schedule or something like that. But overall, she was very important to him, and I think very important to the country. And also, the things she did, such as taking on the counter-drug campaign in terms of talking with kids and education and that sort of thing, it reinforced things he was trying to do. And I think most of this really came out at the funeral, where people like Tom Brokaw spoke, and Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada, and people like that, but also the general buzz through the crowd, including the press, was that she had been a real asset, not only to him, but to the country.
I'm speaking as someone who had done everything I could to defeat Ronald Reagan in '76. She never held it against me.
No, that's right.
Always was, couldn't have been nicer to me personally. My family, social invitations and so forth. There was never any sense of retribution or anything, even though I've been on the opposite side.
The person I wanted to ask you about, and that one of our questioners wanted to ask you about, would to reflect on your fellow duck hunter, Scalia, and what you think he brought to the constitutional understanding.
Justice Scalia was, I think, a giant. In the history of the court, history of American jurisprudence, I think he played a major role that's sadly going to be missed with his departure. Our careers began about the same time. We got to know each other over the years, although I was not an attorney. But we were good friends, and let's say we spent a lot of time hunting together. The moment when things sort of came together, I had, there was a suit before the Supreme Court designed to force me as the chairman of the President's Energy Task Force to divulge a list of all the names I'd talked to as we put together the energy policy. And I'd refused to do that. Congress had asked. General
Federal Advisory Committee Act, is it?
Yes, but we had put together the advisory committee in such a way that it didn't apply in this case. I argued that the president and vice president are free to talk to anybody they want, and they don't have to tell members of Congress or anybody else who we've talked to. And that went to the Supreme Court, and ultimately they ruled in our favor. During the course of this, Justice Scalia and I had been on a duck hunt in Louisiana. And the Sierra Club went to ballistic, alleging that there was something improper about the two of us going on a duck hunt while this case was pending in court. And they wrote a brief demanding...
The duck's perspective?
Well, from the duck's perspective, when they wrote a brief, filed it with the Supreme Court, demanding that Scalia withdraw from consideration of the case. And Justice Scalia, as only Nino could, wrote a beautiful 20-page, elegant document telling them to stick it where the sun don't shine. And filed it. No, he was just a great guy, and I was always tremendously impressed and proud of his friendship, but also I really think he was a historic figure in the American church.
I think it was interesting that he had that ability to separate policy differences from personal relationships. I think the fact that he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were probably the closest two people in the court of any of the two justices was an indication of that fact.
You know, I was just thinking of that myself. There was a ceremony just a little while ago where a bust was unveiled of the vice president, as is the tradition in the Capitol. And interesting that he's in the Capitol and not in the White House or in the old executive office building, but in terms of that kind of friendship, the current vice president, Joe Biden, came and, as you know, made very nice remarks on that afternoon. We started our discussion about the concern that Mr. Biden has raised about dysfunction, and since we've been talking about the Supreme Court vacancy occasioned by now the responsibility to find someone to replace Justice Scalia, is it in your judgment the appropriate thing to do to leave that vacancy until the next election?
I agree with the position that Majority Leader McConnell has taken, basically saying that they won't consider nomination until after the election. They obviously have been times before when the Senate has rejected nominees. I think it's partly a tactical move by the Senate leadership. You've got some close elections out there this year in the Senate, that if you start down that path and you hold hearings and bring a vote to the floor at this stage, that it would put a lot of very difficult political pressure, if you will, on a number of members who are up this time and who are going to have difficult races. To some extent, he protects them from that by taking the position he had. The decision's so important in terms of the future of the court when you replace Nino Scalia, sort of the ultimate conservative justice, with somebody very different in terms of judicial philosophy and so forth. It's going to shape the court for the next 30 years. And so I think it's bound to be the subject of debate and argument on both sides. Obama will argue his point of view. The Republicans will argue their point of view. I'm not surprised that there's controversy there, that they respond.
I think it's interesting to notice that this issue first came up, to my recollection, during George W. Bush's last term. And Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, and Harry Reid all were very vociferous that should there be a vacancy in the Supreme Court, they would never confirm anyone during that last year that he was in office. So I think we just look at this as the Biden-Schumer rule that the Republicans are now following.
Well, it could be. I suspect there's folks out there who would say that was a bipartisan direction that they would hope the country not go in the sense of the cost, as we all know, to the other branch. It's a cost that is being paid. It's one that's been paid in the past where there's been a vacancy, but you like to avoid it if you can in terms of the interests of justice. But be that as it may, it's been a wonderful discussion. You know, I think of so many quips about the vice president. One that comes to mind is Thomas Marshall, who was vice president for Woodrow Wilson, told the story of two brothers leaving the village. One went to sea, one became vice president, neither were heard from again. That's obviously not the case here, and we're very much glad for your presence and your voice. Thank you both.
Thank you.